Okay, today's daf is Ayin Vav, and we're just starting with the new Mishnah. We left off with the new Mishnah yesterday. So Hamotzi Teven Kimlo Pipara. What this is going to talk about is same concept. We're getting back into the some technicalities of the parameters of carrying objects into the public domain on Shabbat, and in particular, what we're going to deal with is quantitative measurement. So quantitatively, how much of a given substance needs to be transported for it to be considered significant? And this is obviously going to depend on that substance and what its typical use is. So, if you take out straw, kimlo pipara, the amount that would need to be taken out in order for it to be significant would be a cow's mouthful of straw, because a cow would eat straw. That makes sense. Atzeh kimlo pi gamal. Atzeh, we're going to find out what it is. It actually turns out to be like the chaff or the straw of beans, as opposed to the kind of chaff or straw that you would find. The first example of straw is a softer straw, but a coarser straw. Amir kimlo pi tzaleh. The husks of wheat, okay, the husks of it could be corn, wheat, whatever it is. Kimlo pi gamal. I'm sorry, kimlo pi taleh, like the size of a sheep's mouth. So each one of these things is the item that it eats. So teven, straw, is what the cow eats. The atzeh is what the camel eats. The amir, the husks of grain, is what the sheep eats. Asavim kimlo pi gidi. Grass, like a mouthful of a goat. A goat has a little mouth. Aleshum vale betzalim. The leaves of onions or garlic, lachim kigrogeret. If they are moist leaves of onions or garlic, then the measurement is a fig's measurement, because that means it's human food. People eat the leaves of onions and garlic. So if they're soft, they're for human consumption, and the measurement is like human food. Yeveshim, if they're dried out, kimlo pigidi, then that was what you would feed to your goat. However, they don't combine one with the other. So, for example, if you took a little bit of straw and a little bit of grass, and you said, well, it's enough, it's kimlo pigidi, I have the amount that would be a mouthful for a goat. So that would be that wouldn't work, because the measurement for teven, the measurement for grass, is for a cow's mouth, which is much bigger. Okay, and so you have, let's say, 50% grass and 50% teven, 50% grass and 50% straw, and you have the amount that would fit in the mouth of a goat, but the goat's mouth is not as big as the cow's mouth. So since it's not the same measurement, you can't apply different measurements to different you can't take one measurement and apply it to the different substances. Each substance has its own measurement that makes it significant. So you can't create a hybrid. We're going to see what the parameters of that are. So now we say, the Gemara says, my atzeh, what is this atzeh stuff? So Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says, or itzah? I think it's what does it say there? It says itzah there. I don't know. I had different vocalizations. I don't know. There's no vowels in here. The one who would know the best would probably be the Steinsaltz. Yeah. So take a look at what he has. So anyway, Amar Rav Yehuda teven shalmine kitnit. This is talking about straw, but not the kind of straw that you would find in a typical field, let's say a wheat field or something like that, but the straw from beans, which is coarser than regular straw. Kiata Rav Dimi, Amar Hamotzi Teven Kimlo Pipara. The Rav Dimi said, if you take out teven, you take out straw, the size of a cow's mouth, lagamal. But the thing was, instead of taking it out for a cow, you took it out to feed to your camel. So, really, what is straw normally fed to? It's normally fed to a cow. And that's why the measurement for straw is normally the amount for a cow's mouth. But you were taking it out for a camel. So you had the measurement for a cow, but your intention was for a camel who eats actually more than a cow.
Does the camel eat straw?
The cow is the one that eats straw. The camel doesn't usually eat straw, right? The camel usually eats the coarser stuff and more of it because he's bigger. So the Gemara says, what do we do in this case? Rabbi Yochanan amar chayav, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar patur. Rabbi Yochanan said that even though, what does he have? You didn't find it? So that even though you took out a measurement which was a sufficient measurement for a cow, since you're taking it out for a camel which wouldn't normally eat this type of food, and for this camel, it's not enough. So therefore, your carrying wouldn't be significant according to Rish Lakish. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he says, listen, since you took the amount out that would have been good for a cow, even though in your case, you're taking it out for a camel, we don't care. The fact that you're taking it out for a camel doesn't matter. You took out an amount that for a cow would have been good. In the evening, that was what Rabbi Yochanan said, but in the morning he changed his mind. He slept on it. He got up in the morning and said, you know what? Since you're carrying it for the sake of a camel, even though you carried it a type of food and an amount of food that was good enough for a cow, since you were carrying it for a camel, and for a camel it's not the right type of food and it's too little, therefore we're not going to count it.
This is atzah.
Atzah, not atzah. Okay, so atzah, so it's in the middle. It's definitely not etzah. I knew that. It couldn't be etzah because etzah is advice. So atzah. Okay. So now we say like this. So the Gemara says, wait a second. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef. First Rav Yosef says, Shapir avad dehadar. Ta'alo chazeh legamal. Rav Yosef says, I agree with Rabbi Yochanan's retraction. Because Rabbi Yochanan originally said that since you were taking out an amount that was fit for a cow, and it was a type of food that was fit for a cow, that was good. That would be a significant carrying and you would be culpable. Now, he changed his mind and said, no, since you were taking it out for a camel, it's not significant. So Rav Yosef said he was right to change his mind. Because it isn't sufficient or the right type of food for a camel, and you were taking it out for a camel. Amar le Abaye, I said, no, the opposite. The first way he had was better. Because let's face it, he took out an amount that was good for a cow, and a type of food that was good for a cow, and we don't care what his personal intention was, whether it was to feed a cow or not. Right? That's how it's defined, exactly. Rather, when Ravin came from Israel, he said, Hamotzi teven kimlo pipara lagamal dekule alma lo pelige dechayav. Everybody agrees. If you took out the type of food and the amount of food that's good for a cow, you carried something significant. Ki pelige b'motze atzah kimlo pipara. The para. The machloket was, what if you took the coarser food that's normally fed to a camel? Now, what did we say? Since it's normally fed to a camel, normally you would have to bring the amount fit for a camel. But you're bringing it out for a cow. Because you decided that you didn't have any straw. And even though the cow doesn't usually eat this kind of coarser food, you're going to give it to him anyway. So you brought out an amount that was fit for the cow. So should that be good? So you would say, well, maybe, maybe not. So let's see. The ibcha itmar, and the opposite was said. Rabbi Yochanan amar patur, Rish Lakish amar chayav. Rabbi Yochanan was the one who was lenient, and Rish Lakish was stringent. Rabbi Yochanan amar patur achila yidei adachag lashma achila. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he says, listen, even though you're actually going to feed this to the cow, and you have enough for the cow, a cow's mouthful, still achila al yidei adachak. It is called eating under duress. Because this is not the normal thing for a cow to eat. This is not comfortable for the cow to eat. So therefore, we're not going to say that the amount, even though in your particular case you're actually going to feed it to the cow, we don't care. It's not good enough. Rish Lakish amar, Rish Lakish says, Chayav, achila lidei adachak shema achila. The bottom line is that the cow is going to eat this. And you brought a cow's mouthful. So even though the food, it's coarser stuff that the cow wouldn't normally eat, but the bottom line is that the food is being given to the cow, and it's enough for the cow, and that's all we need to know. So says Rish Lakish. Okay, so now the Gemara says as follows. So we said regarding the stalks of grain, or the husks, okay, that of corn or whatever, that the measurement is the amount that would be eaten by a goat. Okay? I'm sorry, is that right? Yeah, no, a sheep. Okay, so Vahatan, but it says in a Braita Kigrogeret, that the amount for husks of grain is not the amount that fits in a sheep's mouth, but is actually the amount that fits in that a person would eat, a fig's volume. So the Gemara says, "Idi ve'idi chad shiurahu." They're the same thing. The size of a fig and the size that a sheep will fit in its mouth is the same size. So now the Gemara says, we said that they don't combine together because they don't have the same measurement. So Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina said, that it's true that they cannot be combined for the larger measure, but they could be combined for the smaller measure. So Rashi says, for example, so he gives an example. So Rashi says, for example, since the mouth of a gamal of the camel is larger, so the amount you actually need for straw, which just has to be a cow's mouthful, is smaller than the amount you need for a camel's mouthful. So you could take the soft straw for the cow, and combine it with the coarse straw for a camel if you get to the minimum measure for the camel. In other words, if you're going for the larger measure, if you have in total the larger measure, so then something which has a smaller measure rather, so therefore since it has a smaller measure, it's something which is less of it is more significant. You can combine that with something that has a larger measure, but not vice versa. So, if you wanted to combine, let's say, the coarse straw with the soft straw, and you had half coarse straw, half soft straw, and the total amount you had was the size of a cow's mouth, which is small, that wouldn't be enough. Because the measurement for coarse straw is not a cow's mouth. But if you had coarse straw and soft straw, and they combine together for the camel's mouth, which is the larger amount. So since the minimum for soft straw is actually less anyway, so combining with something else to make it even larger measurement, it can do. Because it's more significant in a sense, because less of it is significant. So that's what Rashi says. He says, right, so you can't use anything that has a larger measure to complete the smaller measure, but vice versa does work. So now the Gemara says, "V'chol delo shavu b'shiurayhu mi mitzdarfin." But isn't true that you can ever combine things that have a different measurement? Who says you can ever combine things that have a different measurement? Even from the more stringent to the more lenient, so to speak, or from something that has a smaller measurement to something that has a larger measurement, you shouldn't be able to combine. And the Gemara gives the reason why. V'yatnam, we learned in the Mishnah, habeged gimel al gimel, v'asak dalet al dalet, v'or he al he, mapat vav al vav. So it's talking about if you have various types of combinations of various types of fabrics, okay, that are mekabel tum'ah. That if it's made out of cloth, it has to be 3 by 3 tefachim. If it's made out of sak, which is goat's hair, it has to be 4 by 4. If it's made out of skin, it has to be 5 by 5, and if it's made out of reeds, it has to be 6 by 6. Okay? If you have, let's say, some kind of a little rug that's made out of these various materials, and you want to know a zav sat on it. Okay, some tamei person sat on it, for example. So that when will it become tamei? V'tanei alam, we learned about it. Habeged v'asak hasak ve'or ha'or v'amapat mitzdarfin zeim zeh. That we said that each of these materials does combine with the other. However, Rabbi Shimon said, Matam, the reason why they combine with one another is because they could be combined into one entity that would be placed over, let's say, as a saddle cover over an animal. The animal doesn't care that it's made out of different fabrics, and it wouldn't be a problem. So since there's a situation in which you would actually combine these into one entity, therefore it doesn't matter that they have different measurements. So if you were to make a patchwork of them, they would combine together to the lower measurement. So if you had the thing that combined that only required 3 by 3, and you combined 2 tefachim of that, and 2 tefachim of the thing that required only 4 by 4, and you made 4 by 4 out of it, then they would combine together. So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? What's the reason why they combine? Because they could actually be made into one thing. Such as something that would hang over the animal that doesn't care that it's made out of multiple fabrics. But something that wouldn't normally be combined. So here you have feed for different animals. You wouldn't normally combine them. Because one type of feed is for one type of animal, and another type of feed is for another.
Would the camel really care to give me some hard stuff and a little soft?
I guess it would. I guess normally they eat what they're accustomed to. They don't mix around the foods. So you wouldn't combine. So Amar Rava says, Hachanami, it's similar here. Chazyan ledugma. Because let's say you are a merchant and you are selling these different foods. You would actually take a plate or a bowl and put a little bit of each one into one bowl to show all the variety that you have. Like a little poo-poo platter, like a little, they would show all the different appetizers that they have on one little plate to show you. So too, the merchant would actually do that with all these different foods. So they would be combined for something. So therefore, they can combine as long as you combine in the right direction. That you combine something that has a lower measurement with something that has a higher measurement. That you're allowed to do. But not vice versa. You can't take something that requires a larger amount to be significant and combine it with something that requires a lesser amount to the lesser measurement. You can only take something that has a lower measurement and combine it with something that has a larger measurement for the larger measurement. So now the new Mishnah says, if you take out food for human beings that's the size of a fig, then you're liable for carrying them. And all different foods are the same measurement. In other words, they all combine. So if you had a little bit of various different foods and it was a total of a fig's worth, that would be significant because they have the same measurement. Because they're all a fig's worth. But this doesn't include the inedible parts of the food. So let's say you had nuts. You had a nut, but it has a shell. The shell doesn't count towards the food. V'garinehen, nor does the pit. V'oktehen, and nor does the stem. V'subanu morsanan, and nor does the bran or the coarse bran that's inside, let's say, the flour, for example. If you had flour and had bran inside, and there's 2 different types of bran. There's the bran that you take out that falls off at an earlier stage in the processing, and then there's a bran that doesn't get sifted out till further on in the process. It's a finer type of bran. The bran doesn't count towards the final thing because if you carry out flour with bran in it, you're not planning on using that flour, the bran. You're going to sift it out anyway, so it's not considered edible. Rabbi Yehuda says,
Didn't we cover in the previous Mishnah that that same concept with regards to it just as being significant or not significant? So how does the leftover of the food become relevant here? Isn't that covered already? That we already said.
Well, the question is if you have, because that's qualitative. There's qualitative and there's quantitative. If qualitative. What's significant, first of all, has to be qualitative, meaning that this is something that somebody would save. This is something significant. And, in other words, it's a type of food that would be significant. And number 2, we're talking about quantitative. So how much?
So this is just another qualification of...
Yeah, how much you have to take out of... Unless you specifically stored less than the measurement and said, I care about 1 sunflower seed. Then we assume that you only care about an amount that is what the average person cares about, namely the fig's worth.
Right.
So even if you had 1 sunflower seed in your pocket and you went out, we're not going to assume that you really cared about the sunflower seed because it's just 1. What we talked about before was a person who puts aside a tiny amount because they are attached to that tiny amount, so they're giving it significance. In this case, it just happens to be that you have in your pocket 1 sunflower seed. So unless it's a fig's volume worth of sunflower seeds, we're not going to consider it significant. But let's say you had a pumpkin seed that has a shell, so you take off the shell when you eat what's inside the pumpkin seed, right? Mm-hmm. So the shell wouldn't count towards the fig's worth. Okay, so you accidentally carried out some pumpkin seeds in your hand. Mm-hmm. We want to know, did you carry out a fig's worth of pumpkin seeds, a fig's volume worth of pumpkin seeds, such that now you're going to have to go and bring a korban chatat for accidentally carrying them? So, because it was accidental, right? So we don't count the shells towards the measurement when we want to make that determination. That's what he's saying. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda says, "Chutz miklipe adashim," except for the shells of adashim, of lentils, okay, of these beans. Because why? Because they are cooked together with the beans. So even though right now they look like a shell, you're going to dump them into the pot and you're going to cook them together, and in the end they're going to be all one thing. Okay, so now the Gemara says, "V'subanu mursanan lo mitzdarfin." Is it really true that the bran inside flour doesn't combine together with the flour? Ve'atnan, but we learned in the Mishnah, "Chamesh rivayim kemach ve'od chayvin b'chala hen v'suban umursanan." But in Masekhet Chala it says that when you take chala, how much does it have to be? It has to be 5 quarters. In other words, 1 1/4 kav is the amount of flour that goes into a dough for the dough to be obligated in separating challah. Chameshit riva'im, they say 5/4, 5 quarters, so 1 1/4 kav. So the Mishnah specifically says that we count towards the measurement the bran that's in the flour. So why here are you telling me that the bran in the flour doesn't count? The Gemara says, Amar Abai said, Chayavin b'chal. So sheken ani ochel pito be'isab bedusa. The reason is because a poor person doesn't sift his flour so well. A poor person needs to get every ounce of whatever that he can out of the flour that he has. He's not going to be particular. He's not going to sift anything out. So therefore, for him, he's going to make his like a whole wheat flour. He's not going to be sifting out anything, and therefore the bran that's in that flour is going to count towards the measurement. So that's in the halachot of challah. Here we're talking about the halachot of carrying. So we want to look at what the average person looks at as significant. The poor person, when it comes to challah, what's the rule? It has to be milechem haaretz. It has to be the bread of the land, and that means the lechem of even the average person, the lechem of the person. I mean, the lechem even of the poor person. Okay, not just the bread of the person who is well off or middle class. So Rashi says that lechem haaretz karinan be. We call this bread of the land, because the people of the land, the poor people, consider this bread that doesn't have its bran sifted out. But Rashi says, "L'inyan Shabbat midid hashiv ba'inan." But when it comes to Shabbat, we look at chashivut, we look at significance, not at whether a person would eat this or not, because a poor person would eat it, but whether it has significance or not. And definitely it doesn't contribute to the significance of the flour from an objective standpoint. So now we said, Amar Rabbi Yehuda said that chutz mikleipe adashim mitbashlot imahen, that when it comes to these lentils, okay, that the shells are cooked with them, so therefore we count the shells towards the quantity. Adashim in polin lo. So according to this, you're telling me that adashim, yes, meaning when it comes to lentils, we count the shell towards the quantity because the shells are cooked with it. But polin lo, but other beans like polin, this is another type of bean. That type of bean, we don't count the shells. Ve'atanya Rabbi Yehuda omer chutz mikleipe polin va'adashim. But didn't Rabbi Yehuda say in another braita that adashim, lentils are not the only kind of bean? Also, these beans called polin also are included. The shells are included in the quantity.
Are they talking about the beans themselves, or
in other words, we're asking whether the shells count towards it. So you carried out beans
for the equivalent, or just for the actual?
For the equivalent. This is all about the measurement.
It's all measurement. Okay.
Right. If you have a pet bean that you love,
right,
and you said this bean to me is like 500 beans, so you made it significant. But if you carried out a handful of beans by accident on Shabbat, and then you realized it was Shabbat, and then someone said, well, let's measure these beans to see if you carried out enough to constitute carrying. Or what are we going to measure? Are we going to measure the shells or not? So we're saying that when it comes to the lentils, we wouldn't measure the shells. So it's also according to these beans, when it comes to these beans, there seems to be a contradiction, because our Mishnah seems to say that only lentils have the special rule that we count the shells. But in another braita, he said that polin also, we count the shells. So now what does it say? No problem. That it depends. If they're fresh beans, we count the shells as well. But old beans we don't. Why don't we count the old beans? Amar Rabbi Abahu said, because when they get old, these beans, they turn black. And so people would want the shells off because they're not going to want the blackness. It's going to look like there's a fly. Literally what that means is, it looks like there's a fly on the plate. Because there's going to be this blackness. If you cook them with the shells, then there's going to be this these black dots all over the food. And people are going to think there are bugs in the food. So they would not use them. So old beans that are dark colored, they're going to remove the shells. New beans that are fresh, the shells would count towards the quantity because those beans were cooked also with the shell. So any bean basically that's cooked with a shell, and the shell is equally edible, in other words, it's just as edible as the bean itself, we're not going to count the shells and the beans as two different things. Anything that you would shell the bean first, for whatever reason, either because of aesthetic reasons or because it's not edible, you wouldn't count the shell towards the quantity when we're measuring whether you carried a significant quantity out on Shabbat. That concludes that parak, the 7th parak, and we're going to begin the 8th parak today. So we continue with this theme of how much do you have to carry of a substance for us to consider you liable on Shabbat. And again, it's the same idea. You carried this out inadvertently, and now we want to know, did you carry enough out that you are culpable? Now, we're not talking about a case where the person is attached to small quantities. We're talking about the average person who just happened to carry it out. So, if you carry out wine, the amount that it takes to mix a cup of wine, we're going to see how much that is. If you took milk, 1 gulp of milk, that's all you need to take out. If you had honey, the amount that you would apply to the wound of an animal. They used to put honey on the wound of an animal, that the animals would get like a type of I don't know what you call it. You know, like when you're holding a heavy bag and you get a sore, like an abrasion, I guess you would say, yeah. So they would put honey on it to treat it when the animals would have it. So the amount that you need for that is the amount of honey that's significant. When it comes to oil, the amount that it takes to anoint the smallest limb, and we're going to see how the Gemara quantifies that later on. Water, the amount that it takes to put on a bandage that would go over the eye. They would have this certain type of salve that they would put on the eye, and it would require water. So that's the minimum amount of water that's considered significant. And any other liquid, a revi'it. Just like a revi'it for any mitzvah. You have to drink a revi'it. So it's revi'it alog. That's a certain quantity that is a universal quantity in halacha. And so that's the quantity that applies for all other liquids. And similarly, even water that you're disposing of. Let's say it's garbage water that you're going to throw out. It's dirty water. Still, if you carried it out, since it has a use, some people will water their garden with the dirty water. Some people will clean their car with the dirty water. Whatever it is. You might use it for something. So it's still significant, but you need a revi'it, you need a quarter of a log for it to be significant. Rabbi Shimon says, Kulan b'revi'it. You know what? I disagree with all of this. I disagree with the idea that wine, that less than a revi'it of wine is significant. I disagree with the idea that a gulp of milk is significant. I disagree with the idea that dvash, that honey, enough honey to put on the wound of the camel, or enough oil to put to anoint a tiny finger, or enough water to make a salve for the eye. I disagree with all of this. I say all liquids, kulan b'revi'it. All of them have to be a revi'it, like the official halachic measurement that we usually use. What were these measurements said about? People who keep them for that purpose. Remember earlier we said that a person who subjectively is attached to a smaller quantity, we recognize the significance that he attaches to that quantity. So if he saved a tinier quantity, we regard that and we say that now he made that object significant, subjectively. So he says, even for that person, Rabbi Shimon says, there's a minimum. Even for that person, there's a minimum. So if you had an amount of honey, if you had an amount of milk that's less than a gulp of milk, a drop of milk, but Mattia said, I love milk so much that drop of milk is like gold. Rabbi Shimon would say, that doesn't make it any more significant. So there are 3 levels according to Rabbi Shimon. There's the person who is attached to a drop of milk. That doesn't do anything. That's not significant. There's a person who is attached to a gulp of milk. That person can make it significant. Then there's the actual measurement, a revi'it, for an average person. An average person who carries out a gulp of milk, according to Rabbi Shimon, will not be liable, because he doesn't consider just the gulp's worth of milk to be significant. He would go by the official measurement, the standard measurement of revi'it. But a person who subjectively was attached to a lesser measurement for carrying out just a gulp's worth of milk would be liable. Less than that, even the person who loves milk and thinks that it's liquid gold would not be liable, because even for those people there's a minimum measurement according to Rabbi Shimon.
And how does he get the minimum measurement?
He's saying that these minimum measurements.
Matthias loves a drop.
Right.
That's
So
it.
is
Drop
it
loves a drop.
so no measurement a drop, or is
No, that's the whole point. In other words, the Chachamim say that the Chachamim agree with that. The Chachamim say that even if you love a drop and you think it's liquid gold, then that would make it significant. Rabbi Shimon is coming along and saying, no, it has to have utility.
No, but does
it has to have utility.
But would Rabbi Shimon say that Matthias, me who loves
a drop? No, it doesn't count. It doesn't do anything.
So even me who loves a drop.
Yeah, even you. Doesn't work.
Right. So that's what
He's saying. That's the purpose of these examples. According to Rabbi Shimon, all of these examples are to tell you what's the minimum utility.
Right.
For a crazy person who really loves milk. Right? Not for the average person. The average person, there's an objective measurement of revi'it. But for the crazy person who loves milk, even he can only love milk that has utility.
Right.
So in the dispute earlier of Rabbi Yochanan and Beis Lakish, we're talking about animal food.
Right.
There, it's also a subjective thing where the guy, it's an argument of whether it's subjective or not, whether I want to use this coarse stuff for a cow.
Right.
So there would be the same argument.
That's what they were arguing about. In other words, if you decide to force your animal to eat something which you wouldn't normally eat, so does that make it now significant because you are assigning it as cow food?
So it's a lot like Rabbi Shimon here. It's like decided that it is.
No, it isn't like Rabbi Shimon. We say that a person, and this is also talking about quantity. That's more about quality. The argument between Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, that was more qualitative. Can you assign a feed that's normally for a cow for a camel and vice versa? Here we're saying quantitatively, if I save less than anybody would ever use for any utility, can I still invest it with significance or not? The rabbis say, yeah, it's totally subjective. Rabbi Shimon says, no, even there has to be some minimum measurement. And that's what these examples are for. So the Chachamim say, no, the minimum examples here are for everybody. That if you take out a gulp's worth of milk, everybody would be chayav. Rabbi Shimon is actually more lenient than that. He's saying, no, if you took one of these minimums, it wouldn't be significant for you. Because a gulp's worth of milk is not significant for the average person.
It makes it simpler as a matter of halacha. I mean, it's otherwise it becomes impossible to.
Right.
Remember all these things.
Right, you have to remember all these details.
Yeah.
So now the Gemara says, Tana kedem mizigat kos yafeh. What does it mean, the amount that it takes to mix a cup of wine? A nice cup of wine. Well, my kos yafeh, what's a nice cup of wine? Kos shel beracha, what you're going to use for kiddush, you're going to use for birkat hamazon, a nice cup. And how much is that? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Baravua. Rav Nachman said that Rabba Baravua said, Kos shel beracha tzarich sheyeh bo rova revi'it kedei sheyimzegeno v'yamod al revi'it. You have to mix in a quarter of a revi'it. In other words, if you want a revi'it of wine in total. So what you mix is a 1 part strong undiluted wine and 3 parts water. And then you mix it. So therefore, how much wine would you be carrying out here? You would be carrying out a quarter of a revi'it. Because that's the amount that it takes for mizigat takos to mix it. Because you're going to have 3 parts water and 1 part wine. Amar Rava says, Af anan nami tanina. We also learn this, and we move to Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, Hamotzi Yayin Kedei Mizigat Kos, because it says in our Mishnah that somebody who takes out the amount of wine that it would be required to mix a cup of wine, V'tanei ala Kedei Mizigat Kos Yafeh, V'katanei Sefa, Ushar Kol HaMashkin Be'Revi'it. And we said that what does it mean? The amount of wine that would be for a good cup. It means. But what does it mean, the amount of wine that would be for a cup? It means a good cup. And it says at the end, all other drinks are a revi'it. Okay? In other words, all other drinks that you need to bring out the amount that would be mixed into a revi'it. If you had a revi'it of wine, it would actually be made of 1/4 actual wine, right, and 3/4 water. Rava is following his opinion. Because Rava says, "Kol chamara dela dare al chad telat maya." Any wine that you don't put on 1 part, 3 parts water, lav chamrahu. That's not going to be good wine. So therefore, he would say that 1/4 of a revi'it is the amount that the Mishnah is talking about, because that's the amount of undiluted wine you would carry out on Shabbat. Amar Abai said, "Shetei teshuvot b'davar." I have 2 objections to you. Chadadatan v'hamazug shnei chelkei mayim ve'achad yain min hayayin asheroni. He said, I have 2 problems with this. First of all, we learned in the Mishnah that when we wanted to determine what is the color red for identifying dam nida, okay, we wanted to identify the blood, the color of blood that's considered blood that would make a woman tameh. They used to measure different colors. It wasn't just any red, but there were specific reds that were tameh and specific ones that were not. So they said, take wine from the Sharon and mix it with 2 parts water, not 3 parts, to get the color. So that would imply that actually you're not putting 1 part wine, 3 parts water. You're putting 1 part wine, 2 parts water. And he says, and furthermore, the water hasn't been added to this wine. How can you count it? In other words, you are taking the amount of wine that you would carry out that would be mixed with water, but there is no actual water. So really what you're taking out is not useful, because there's no water mixed in. The water is in the jug at home, and you're counting this undiluted wine because it's a 1/4 that would be mixed with the other 3/4. How could that be? So Rava answers him. So Amar le Rava answers. He says, why was the wine from the Sharon? Why was it 1 part wine and 2 parts water? That's because it was weaker wine. That's why. But normal wine, it's 1 part wine and 3 parts water. And he says, Inami, alternatively, hata mishum chazuta, or it could also be because over there, what are they discussing? They're not discussing how to make good wine. They're discussing a specific color that they're trying to create. That's a different issue. Aval ta'ama ba'etefe, but to have a good taste, you would need more water. Udeka amrat mayim bakaru mitztarfin li'inyan Shabbat midin dechashiv ba'inan v'anami hachashiv. The answer that Rava says is, true, water hasn't been added to this undiluted wine yet. That's true. But the fact of the matter is that this undiluted wine is useful because you're going to mix it with water. And it's an amount that could become a cup of wine. So therefore it has significance, and if you carry it out, even though it's not a revi'it, it's 1/4 of a revi'it. So if it were any other beverage, it would not be significant. Because it's significant when it's going to be mixed with water, it's something you would take out, because you would carry it to go find water to complete your cup of wine. And therefore, since it has significance, carrying it out on Shabbat is a significant act.